3 hours ago I was nobody. A ghost the world had already buried and forgotten. My own mother held a memorial for me, wore black, cried pretty tears for the cameras, and then took my inheritance to buy herself a mansion. But right now, I'm standing across the street from that mansion, watching flames lick the windows of her home office. My phone will not stop buzzing. FBI agents are shouting into radios. Firefighters are sprinting past me with hoses. And somewhere inside that chaos, my mother is finally learning what it feels like to lose everything. She wanted to erase me. Called me a mistake. Well, mother, consider this your wake-up call. The noise did not fade all at once. It dropped away in pieces, like a room emptying after something irreversible had already happened. Sirens still echoed in the distance, but they felt far away now, muted, as if they belonged to someone else's life. I stood there without moving. My body felt heavy, rooted to the pavement, while my mind struggled to catch up with reality. Moments earlier, everything had been loud, frantic, impossible to ignore. Now there was only stillness, thick and uncomfortable. Shock does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it feels like staring at a wall and forgetting why you are there. I noticed small details instead of big ones. The cold air against my hands. The way my breath came slower than it should have. The faint smell of smoke drifting through the street. People were talking around me, but their words blurred together. I could see their mouths moving, their faces turning toward the house, toward me, but none of it landed properly. It felt like my mind had stepped back. Observing from a distance, it did not know how to close. I tried to understand what I was feeling. Relief did not fit. Anger felt too sharp. Sadness felt unfinished. What settled instead was confusion. I had imagined this moment so many times, but nothing matched the reality of it. There was no sudden sense of victory, no rush of satisfaction, just a hollow pause where emotions refused to line up neatly. My chest tightened, not from panic, but from the weight of everything finally slowing down. Years of tension had been holding me upright, and now that pressure was loosening in ways I did not know how to control. I realized then how exhausting it had been to stay alert for so long. The silence after impact is not peaceful. It is disorienting. It leaves you standing between what just ended and what has not begun yet, unsure where to place your thoughts or your feet. I looked at the house again, at the broken calm of it, and understood that something inside me had shifted too. Nothing could go back to the way it was, and I was not sure yet what that meant. Before that day, my life looked ordinary from the outside. I was young, hopeful, and convinced that effort could fix almost anything. I believed that if I tried hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and proved myself useful enough, things would eventually fall into place. I was the kind of person who planned ahead. I liked structure. I liked knowing what came next. There was comfort in routines, in small goals, in imagining a future that felt stable and predictable. I trusted people easily, especially family. I assumed love, even when complicated, was still something solid underneath. Emotionally, I was steady. Not overly confident, but not broken either. I laughed easily. I made plans without second-guessing every detail. I believed disagreements could be talked through and misunderstandings cleared up with time. I carried optimism without realizing how fragile it was. I did not walk through life guarded. I did not expect betrayal to come from the place that was supposed to feel safest. When problems appeared, I looked inward first, assuming responsibility instead of suspicion. That was simply who I was. I cared deeply about belonging. Approval mattered to me more than I admitted. I wanted to be seen as dependable, reasonable, someone worth keeping around. I measured my value by how little trouble I caused and how well I fit into expectations that were never clearly explained. At that point, I still believed silence was maturity. I thought patience was strength. I believed endurance would be rewarded eventually. When something hurt, I told myself it was temporary. When something felt unfair, I convinced myself there had to be a reason I did not understand yet. There was no constant fear back then. No heavy alertness. No calculating every word before speaking. My emotions moved freely, unguarded by caution or self-protection. I trusted that the people in my life wanted the best for me, even when their actions felt confusing. Looking back now, I realize how unprepared I was. Not because I was naive, but because I still believed in the version of life where love did not come with conditions. Where family did not turn into strangers overnight. where trust, once given, was not used as leverage. That was who I was before that day. Someone whole, without knowing how easily that wholeness could be taken apart. Growing up, I learned early how much attention mattered. Not in obvious ways. Not through loud rejection or constant conflict. It was quieter than that. Love felt conditional, measured by behavior, by timing, by how convenient I was at any given moment. I wanted to be chosen. That need showed up in small decisions. I paid attention to moods. I adjusted myself without being asked. I learned when to speak and when silence was safer. Approval became something I chased without fully realizing it. I tried to earn affection. Good grades felt important not because I loved achievement but because praise felt like proof. Being helpful felt necessary, not generous. I told myself that if I stayed agreeable enough, if I caused no trouble, I would eventually feel secure. Belonging did not feel automatic. It felt like something that could disappear if I failed to maintain it. I watched how love was given and withdrawn, how attention shifted based on usefulness or performance. Over time, I internalized the idea that love was something you qualified for, not something you simply received. I compared myself constantly. Not out of jealousy but out of curiosity. I wanted to understand what others did differently. Why affection came more easily to some. Why I felt like I was always standing one step outside of something everyone else seemed to access naturally. I learned to minimize my needs. Wanting reassurance felt embarrassing. Asking for comfort felt risky. I convinced myself independence was strength, even when it came from feeling unwanted rather than empowered. Validation became quiet currency. A nod of approval. A softened tone. A moment of acknowledgement that made me feel visible again. Those moments stayed with me longer than they should have because they felt rare. I told myself this was normal. That everyone felt this way sometimes. That wanting to be chosen was just part of growing up. I did not see it as emotional hunger yet. I saw it as motivation, as maturity, as learning how relationships worked. What I did not realize was how deeply this shaped me. I became skilled at reading rooms and adjusting myself accordingly. I learned to be whatever felt most acceptable in the moment. I mistook adaptability for connection. Deep down I carried a simple hope. That one day I would not have to try so hard. That one day love would feel steady instead of earned. That someone would look at me and choose me without hesitation or conditions. That hope followed me quietly for years. And it made what came later hurt in ways I could never have predicted. Trying to be perfect did not feel like a choice. It felt like a requirement I never agreed to but followed anyway. I believed that if I stayed careful enough, helpful enough, and quiet enough, I could finally earn a place where nothing would be questioned. Effort became my default setting. I anticipated needs before they were spoken. I adjusted plans to avoid conflict. I apologized quickly, even when I did not fully understand what I was apologizing for. Keeping the peace felt more important than being honest about how I felt. Sacrifice came in subtle forms. I put my opinions last. I delayed my own wants. I told myself that compromise was maturity, even when it left me drained. I learned how to say yes while my body said no, and I convinced myself that was what love required. I chased approval through consistency. If I stayed reliable, maybe I would feel secure. If I stayed agreeable, maybe I would not be pushed aside. I believed perfection could protect me from disappointment. It did not. Emotional exhaustion crept in slowly. It showed up as restlessness, as a constant tightness in my chest, as the feeling that no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. I began measuring my worth by how little inconvenience I caused. I stopped expressing frustration, not because it disappeared, but because it felt dangerous. I learned to smile through discomfort. I told myself resilience meant endurance, not honesty. I praised myself for staying strong, even when strength looked like self-erasure. Perfection became isolating. People saw competence, not fatigue. They saw calm, not confusion. They saw reliability, not the cost of maintaining it. I became easy to rely on and hard to truly know. I told myself this was temporary. That once things stabilized, I could relax. That once I proved myself, I could finally breathe. I kept pushing forward, ignoring the warning signs that my emotional reserves were running out. What I did not realize was how deeply this pattern was shaping me. Trying to be perfect left no room for vulnerability. It left no space for mistakes or needs. It taught me to prioritize acceptance over authenticity, approval over peace. By the time I noticed how tired I was, exhaustion had already settled into my bones. I was doing everything right, and I had never felt more invisible. That contradiction stayed with me, quietly, waiting for the moment when trying harder would no longer be possible. I started noticing it everywhere. Not because I was looking for it, but because it kept finding me. Small moments, ordinary scenes, the kind people barely think about. A warm laugh shared easily. A gentle check-in that did not feel forced. A sense of comfort that moved naturally between people. I watched it quietly. Friends talked about feeling supported. About being understood without having to explain themselves. About knowing they mattered without having to prove it every day. I listened, nodded, smiled at the right moments, while something inside me stayed slightly out of sync. Comparison crept in without permission. I asked myself questions I did not want answers to. What were they doing differently? What did they have that I did not? Why did connection seem effortless for others while I always felt like I was reaching for it from a distance? The jealousy was not loud. It did not come with anger or bitterness. It was softer than that. A quiet ache that showed up unexpectedly. A tight feeling in my chest when I saw someone being chosen without hesitation. A heaviness I carried silently because it felt wrong to resent something so basic. I felt left out in subtle ways. Not excluded but overlooked. Not rejected but never fully included either. It was like standing just outside a circle, close enough to see what was happening, but never close enough to step in naturally. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself every family was different. Every relationship had its flaws. I convinced myself I did not need what others had. That independence was better. That needing less meant being stronger. But those explanations never lasted. Late at night, the questions returned. Why did affection feel conditional for me? Why did warmth feel borrowed instead of steady? Why did I always feel like I was waiting for permission to exist comfortably? I did not talk about it. Admitting that comparison hurt felt embarrassing. Wanting more felt selfish. So I kept those thoughts to myself and let them settle quietly, shaping the way I saw myself and my place in the world. Watching others receive what came so easily to them did not make me angry. It made me aware. Aware of an absence I could no longer ignore. A gap between what I told myself I did not need and what I secretly hoped would one day be mine. That awareness stayed with me, growing sharper over time. And it made what followed hurt even more than I was prepared for. The damage did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, quietly, over years where nothing looked wrong on the surface. There were no dramatic scenes, no constant shouting, no obvious signs that something was breaking. From the outside, everything appeared manageable. From the inside, I was learning how to survive without being seen. Neglect has a specific weight. It does not bruise the skin, but it presses on the chest. It shows up in the absence of care, in the lack of curiosity about how you are really doing. I learned early that my feelings were inconvenient, so I learned to keep them small. Pressure became constant. I felt responsible for maintaining calm, for avoiding tension, for making sure nothing escalated. I monitored tone, timing, expressions. I adjusted myself automatically without thinking because reacting honestly felt unsafe. I lived in survival mode. That meant staying alert. That meant anticipating reactions before they happened. That meant learning which versions of myself were acceptable and which ones needed to stay hidden. I stopped asking questions that might lead to conflict. I stopped sharing thoughts that might be dismissed. Silence felt protective. If I stayed quiet, I could avoid disappointment. If I did not express needs, they could not be ignored. That logic made sense at the time. It helped me get through days that felt emotionally tight and unpredictable. Over time, that silence became exhausting. I carried tension in my body without realizing it. My shoulders stayed tight. My thoughts raced even when nothing was happening. I slept lightly, always half aware, always prepared for something to go wrong. I learned to downplay discomfort. When something hurt, I told myself it was not serious enough to matter. When something felt unfair, I convinced myself it was normal. I minimized my own experience so effectively that I almost believed it myself. Neglect teaches you to doubt your instincts. I questioned whether I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too demanding. I wondered if expecting basic care was unreasonable. I compared myself to others who seemed fine and assumed the problem had to be me. Survival mode narrows your world. It focuses you on getting through, not growing. I stopped imagining better outcomes. I stopped expecting change. I learned how to exist within limitations rather than challenge them. The most damaging part was how invisible it all felt. There were no clear moments to point to, no single incident to explain the exhaustion. Just a steady erosion of emotional safety that left me tired in ways rest could not fix. By the time I noticed how deeply it had affected me, the damage had already settled into patterns I did not know how to break. I was still functioning. I was still showing up. But inside, something had been worn down quietly, patiently, over years of being neglected without anyone noticing, including me. At some point, blame turned inward. It did not happen suddenly. It settled in quietly, like a habit I did not remember choosing. Every uncomfortable moment, every cold response, every silence that felt heavier than it should have. I traced it back to myself. I must have done something wrong. That thought repeated itself often enough to feel true. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for mistakes I might have missed. A tone that sounded off. A word that landed the wrong way. A reaction that felt unnecessary in hindsight. Self-doubt became automatic. When things felt distant, I assumed I was asking for too much. When affection felt limited, I told myself I had not earned it. I learned how to take responsibility for emotional gaps that were never mine to fill. Guilt followed closely behind. I felt guilty for wanting reassurance. Guilty for feeling hurt. Guilty for noticing patterns that made me uncomfortable. I questioned whether my expectations were unrealistic, whether I was being unfair by wanting more than what was offered. The conflict inside me grew louder. One part of me felt exhausted and unseen. Another part insisted that I needed to be more patient, more understanding, less sensitive. Those voices argued constantly, leaving me stuck between acknowledging my pain and dismissing it entirely. I apologized too easily, not because I always believed I was wrong, but because apologizing felt like the fastest way to restore calm. Peace mattered more to me than clarity. I learned how to take on responsibility simply to keep things from escalating. Over time, that habit reshaped how I saw myself. I stopped trusting my reactions. I questioned my emotions before I questioned anyone else's behavior. I convinced myself that if I could just adjust enough, everything would settle into place. It never did. Blaming myself created a strange sense of control. If I was the problem, then fixing myself could fix everything. That belief was comforting, even when it was damaging. It gave me hope, even as it chipped away at my confidence. I did not recognize how unfair that was. I held myself to standards no one else followed. I carried guilt that did not belong to me. I treated my own needs like flaws instead of signals. By the time I noticed how deeply this pattern ran, it had already shaped my self-image. I did not just doubt situations anymore. I doubted myself. And that doubt made it easier for everything else to stay exactly the same. Hope became my quiet strategy. I told myself that time softened sharp edges, that distance between moments could smooth what conversations never resolved. Waiting felt safer than confronting what I did not yet have the strength to name. I trusted the future more than the present. Whenever something felt off, I postponed the discomfort. I convinced myself it was temporary. Stress. Misunderstanding. A phase that would pass once circumstances changed. Time, I believed, had a way of fixing things without forcing difficult decisions. So I waited. I waited through awkward silences that lingered longer than they should have. I waited through moments when warmth felt inconsistent, unpredictable. I waited because patience felt mature, and speaking up felt risky. Hope gave me something to hold. It allowed me to stay calm instead of asking questions that might break what little balance existed. It helped me explain away patterns that made me uneasy. I told myself that love did not need to be discussed, only endured. I imagined a turning point ahead, a moment when things would click into place, when understanding would arrive naturally, when effort would finally be noticed and appreciated. That imagined future kept me still. Waiting became a habit. I delayed my feelings, telling myself there would be a better time to address them. I postponed honesty, believing timing mattered more than truth. Each delay felt reasonable on its own. Together, they created distance I did not recognize until it had already grown. Time kept moving. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. Nothing dramatic changed. The tension did not disappear. The silence did not soften. It simply became familiar. Hope slowly shifted shape. What once felt comforting started to feel heavy. Carrying expectations without evidence became exhausting. I began to realize that waiting was not neutral. It was a choice that allowed everything to remain exactly as it was. That realization unsettled me. I had trusted time to fix something that required action. I had mistaken endurance for progress. I had believed that staying patient would protect me from disappointment. Instead, it postponed it. And somewhere in that waiting, I started to sense that time was not fixing anything at all. It was revealing it. That day started like any other. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. No warning signs that screamed danger. And maybe that was what made it worse. The normalcy of it all created a false sense of safety I did not realize I was relying on. Tension had been building for a long time. It lived in unfinished conversations and careful silences. It showed up in the way I chose my words more cautiously than usual, in the way I read expressions before speaking. That morning, everything felt slightly off, like the air itself was heavier. I tried to stay neutral. I moved through the day quietly, avoiding topics that felt sensitive. I told myself this was just another moment to endure. Another situation that patience could smooth over. But beneath that calm, something was pressing forward, demanding to be acknowledged. Small comments landed harder than they should have. A look that lingered too long. A tone that felt sharper than necessary. Nothing explosive on its own, but together they created a sense of pressure that refused to ease. I felt it in my chest, tight and restless, like my body knew something my mind was still resisting. When the conversation finally shifted, it did so abruptly. The words were casual at first, almost dismissive. Then they became pointed. The space between us felt smaller, crowded by everything that had been left unsaid for years. I could feel my heart speeding up, not from anger, but from the fear of what might surface. I tried to explain myself. I kept my voice steady. I chose honesty over avoidance, believing clarity might help. That choice changed everything. The moment I spoke, the balance shattered. The response was immediate, defensive, sharp, loaded with frustration that had clearly been waiting for an opening. Accusations surfaced that felt disproportionate, misplaced. I realized then that this was not about what I had just said. This was about everything. Years of silence collided in that moment. Every unspoken resentment found its voice. Every assumption hardened into certainty. I felt overwhelmed not by volume, but by the weight of it all landing at once. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear of confrontation, but from the realization that something irreversible was happening. I could sense the shift, the moment when things move past repair and into consequence. I recognized the feeling too late. This was not a discussion. This was a breaking point. What followed was not loud at first. It was controlled, deliberate, and deeply cutting. Each word felt intentional, aimed to wound rather than resolve. I stood there listening, struggling to understand how things had reached this place without me noticing sooner. By the time the argument reached its peak, there was no space left for compromise. The tension that had been quietly building for years finally released, not in chaos, but in clarity that hurt more than confusion ever could. That day did not just explode. It exposed everything that had been waiting underneath. And I knew, without fully understanding how yet, that nothing would be the same after it. The room went quiet before she said it. Not the calm kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your ears, warning you that something irreversible is about to land. I remember noticing how still everything felt, as if even the walls were listening. She did not raise her voice. That was what made it worse. Her tone was controlled, almost casual, as if she was stating a fact she had rehearsed many times before. She looked at me with an expression I could not place at first, something between irritation and finality. Then she said it. One sentence. Said once. Clearly. Without hesitation. It did not echo. It did not need to. The words settled into my chest immediately, heavy and absolute. For a moment my mind refused to process them. I stood there waiting for clarification, for context, for anything that would soften the meaning. Nothing came. My body reacted before my thoughts did. My breath caught, shallow and uneven. A strange pressure built behind my eyes, but no tears fell. It felt like my emotions had stalled, stuck between disbelief and understanding. That sentence rearranged everything. Years of effort, patience, self-blame, and hope collapsed into a single sharp realization. I understood then that I had been arguing for something that never existed. I had been waiting for change from someone who had already made a decision long ago. My thoughts scattered. I searched for responses that no longer mattered, questions that suddenly felt pointless, explanations that would not change what had already been said. The urge to defend myself surfaced, then disappeared just as quickly. There was nothing left to defend. Inside, something gave way quietly. Not a dramatic break. Not a visible reaction. It felt more like a door closing, solid and final. The part of me that believed this could still be fixed stepped back and went silent. I noticed how steady her posture was. How resolved she seemed. That steadiness confirmed what her words already had. This was not said in anger. It was said in truth, or at least in her version of it. That made it harder to dismiss and impossible to forget. I felt small not because I was weak, but because I had just seen myself clearly in her eyes. Unwanted. Unnecessary. Easily discarded. The room felt different after that sentence. Colder. Sharper. As if the air itself had shifted. I stood there, absorbing the weight of it, realizing that something fundamental had ended without ceremony. That one line did not start the damage. It revealed it. And in that moment I knew I could never hear my place in her life the same way again. Something inside me had collapsed. And something else, quieter but stronger, was beginning to take its place. I do not remember deciding to leave. My body moved before my mind could argue with it. One moment I was standing there, still processing the weight of what had been said, and the next I was turning away, stepping back, creating distance without fully understanding why. The room felt smaller as I moved. Not physically but emotionally. Like the space itself had become too tight to breathe in. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last, as if I was carrying something invisible that kept pulling me backward. I did not look back. Not out of strength but out of self-preservation. I was afraid that if I saw her face again, I would lose the fragile control I was holding onto. Silence felt safer than saying something I could never take back. The hallway stretched longer than usual. Each step echoed louder than it should have. I focused on the rhythm of my movement, the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, because focusing on anything else felt overwhelming. Outside, the air felt colder. It hit my skin sharply, grounding me in a way the conversation never had. I stood there for a moment, unsure of where to go or what to do next. The world around me continued as if nothing had changed. Cars passed. People moved. Life carried on. The shock began to settle then. Not all at once but in slow waves. The meaning of her words replayed in my head, clearer now that I was away from her. Each repetition felt more final, more real. I walked without direction. Distance felt necessary, even if I did not yet know what it would give me. The farther I moved from that space, the more I realized how unsteady I felt. My hands shook slightly. My thoughts blurred at the edges. I tried to feel something specific. Anger, sadness, relief. None of them fit cleanly. What I felt was disorientation, like my internal compass had been thrown off and I did not know how to recalibrate. The shock was no longer sharp. It was dull, heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. The kind that leaves you moving slowly, carefully, afraid that one wrong step might cause everything to collapse at once. By the time I stopped walking, I realized how far I had gone. Not in distance but in understanding. Walking away did not fix anything. It did not make the pain disappear. But it created space. And in that space, the reality of what had happened began to settle quietly and deeply, into a place I knew I would never return from unchanged. I had left the room broken, but I had also left it behind. The breakdown did not happen immediately. First, I stayed functional. I went through motions. I answered messages when necessary. I told myself I was fine because saying anything else felt too complicated. Silence became my shield, the only thing holding me together. Loneliness settled in slowly. It showed up in the quiet moments when there was nothing to distract me. Late evenings felt longer than they used to. Rooms felt emptier, even when I was not alone. I realized how much energy I had spent pretending I did not need anyone. Sleep became unreliable. Some nights I could not fall asleep at all. My mind replayed that sentence over and over, each time with sharper clarity. Other nights I slept briefly, only to wake up suddenly heart racing, as if my body was bracing for impact that never came. Thoughts spiraled in the dark. I questioned everything. Every memory. Every moment I once believed meant something. I wondered how long the truth had existed without me seeing it. I wondered if I had imagined closeness that was never real. During the day I held myself together. At night everything fell apart. Tears came unexpectedly, sometimes without clear emotion attached to them. Other times nothing came at all, just a hollow pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe deeply. I felt disconnected from my own reactions, unsure which ones were real and which ones were delayed. The silence was heavy. I did not talk about what happened. Explaining it felt impossible. The words felt too personal, too exposed. I was afraid that saying them out loud would make everything permanent in a way I was not ready to accept yet. Isolation deepened. I withdrew without announcing it. I stopped reaching out. I told myself I needed space, but what I really needed was safety. Being alone felt easier than risking misunderstanding or pity. My thoughts became harsher. I replayed scenarios, imagined different outcomes, criticized myself for staying so long, for hoping so hard. I oscillated between blaming her and blaming myself, never landing anywhere stable. There were moments when I felt detached from reality. Time blurred. Days passed without clear markers. I functioned but without intention. My body moved but my mind felt fragmented, scattered, overwhelmed. That was the breakdown. Not loud. Not obvious. Quiet. Internal. Relentless. I did not collapse in front of anyone. I unraveled privately, in silence, piece by piece, trying to hold on to some version of myself while everything familiar felt like it was slipping away. And in that silence, something important began to surface. A realization I was not ready to face yet. But it was there waiting. Growing stronger each time the night stretched on and sleep refused to come. Once the silence settled, the questions began. They did not arrive all at once. They surfaced slowly, in moments when my mind had nothing else to hold on to. Without distraction, I was left facing myself in ways I had always avoided. I started to wonder who I was without her approval. For so long, my sense of worth had been shaped by how useful, agreeable, or acceptable I seemed. When that framework collapsed, I felt unanchored. I struggled to identify what remained when the roles I played no longer applied. The reflection was painful. I examined memories differently now, searching for signs I might have missed. Moments I once considered normal took on new meaning. I questioned whether affection had ever been genuine or simply convenient. Doubt reached deeper than situations. Touched my identity. I wondered if something about me was fundamentally flawed. If I was difficult to love. If I asked for too much. These thoughts felt intrusive yet familiar, like echoes of beliefs I had carried quietly for years. I questioned my instincts. I wondered why I stayed. Why I tried so hard. Why I ignored discomfort in favor of hope. The self-criticism felt sharp, unforgiving. It was easier to blame myself than to fully accept the reality of what had happened. Times I felt fragmented. Like different versions of myself were arguing internally. One part insisted I deserved better. Another insisted I should have known better. That conflict left me emotionally exhausted, unsure which voice to trust. I looked at myself differently, not with curiosity but with scrutiny. I evaluated my reactions, my needs, my boundaries, questioning whether they were valid or excessive. I tried to define myself through logic when emotions felt unreliable. The identity I had built no longer felt solid. It had been shaped by adaptation, by minimizing needs, by seeking approval. Without those anchors, I felt exposed, uncertain, and vulnerable. There was grief in that realization. Grief for the version of myself who believed endurance was enough. Grief for the years spent measuring worth through someone else's acceptance. Questioning my worth did not feel productive. It felt destabilizing. Yet it was unavoidable. When something foundational is removed, everything built on top of it must be examined, even when that examination hurts. I did not find answers immediately. What I found instead was honesty. Uncomfortable, painful, but necessary honesty that would eventually force me to rebuild, not from expectation but from truth. That process had only just begun. The realization did not arrive with clarity. It emerged quietly, through exhaustion rather than insight. After questioning myself endlessly, after replaying every memory and every mistake, something inside me finally slowed down. I was tired, not just emotionally but deeply at a level rest could not touch. I realized how much energy I had spent trying to earn something that should never have required negotiation. Love was not supposed to feel like a transaction. That thought settled heavily, but it also brought relief. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that nothing I could say or do would change her perception. The problem was not effort. It was alignment. I could not beg for something she had already decided to withhold. That truth was painful, but it was also grounding. It shifted responsibility back to where it belonged. I stopped searching for the perfect explanation, the perfect apology, the perfect version of myself that might unlock care. There was no version that would. Letting go of that hope hurt. It felt like admitting defeat, even though it was not. It felt like surrendering a dream I had protected for years. But beneath that loss, something steadier began to form. Self-respect. I noticed a subtle change in my thoughts. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped planning ways to prove my worth. The constant mental noise softened. Inner strength does not arrive loudly. It starts as a boundary you finally acknowledge, a limit you recognize without guilt. I understood then that continuing to chase validation would only deepen the damage already done. Choosing not to beg was not rejection. It was self-preservation. I began to see that love offered conditionally was not love I wanted anymore. Came at too high a cost. It required shrinking, explaining, justifying my existence. I did not want that version of connection. Realizing I could not beg for love did not make the pain disappear. But it gave it shape. Gave me direction. It allowed me to stop investing energy in something that was never going to return it. That shift marked the beginning of something new. Not healing yet. Not peace. But strength. Quiet, deliberate strength that did not need permission to exist. Action did not mean confrontation. It did not mean raising my voice, demanding explanations, or forcing apologies that would never be sincere. The action I chose was quieter, but far more difficult. It was self-respect. For the first time, I stopped reacting and started deciding. I asked myself what protecting my peace actually looked like, not in theory but in practice. The answer was uncomfortable because it required consistency instead of emotion. I set boundaries, not as punishment but as protection. I limited access to my time, my thoughts, and my emotional energy. I stopped engaging in conversations that left me feeling diminished. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds. This was not aggression. There were no dramatic announcements. No ultimatums. No scenes. I simply changed my behavior. I responded less. I shared less. I observed more. I let silence replace arguments that went nowhere. That shift was powerful. First, it felt unnatural. I worried I was being cold or unfair. Old habits urged me to soften, to over-explain, to make sure everyone was comfortable. But each time I resisted that impulse, something inside me steadied. Clear boundaries brought clarity. I could see patterns more easily when I stopped participating in them. I noticed how often my presence had been taken for granted. How quickly my needs were dismissed when they became inconvenient. Distance made those truths impossible to ignore. Taking action also meant choosing myself in small ways. I prioritized rest without guilt. I allowed space for emotions without rushing to justify them. I made decisions based on what felt grounding rather than what felt acceptable to others. There was strength in restraint. I did not need to prove anything. I did not need validation to move forward. The action I took was deliberate, thoughtful, and rooted in respect for myself. This choice changed how I carried myself. My thoughts became clearer. My reactions slowed. I felt less pulled by expectations that never truly served me. Boundaries gave me room to breathe. I realized then that self-respect is not loud. It does not seek approval. It does not require acknowledgement. It exists quietly, guiding decisions even when no one else notices. Deciding to take action did not mean everything improved overnight, but it marked a turning point. I was no longer waiting for change. I was creating it calmly and intentionally, by choosing not to participate in what harmed me. That decision would shape everything that came next. Building a life without them did not begin with confidence. It began with uncertainty and small, deliberate steps. Once I stopped centering my decisions around their approval, I had to learn what my life actually looked like without that constant reference point. Independence felt unfamiliar at first. I was used to measuring choices against expectations that were never clearly stated, yet always present. Without that framework, even simple decisions felt heavier. I questioned myself often, but this time the questioning was different. It was curious, not self-punishing. I started focusing inward. I paid attention to what energized me and what drained me. I noticed how certain environments felt calmer, how some conversations left me lighter instead of tense. These observations became guideposts, helping me shape routines that felt supportive rather than exhausting. Personal growth did not look dramatic. There were no sudden transformations, no overnight clarity. Growth showed up quietly in consistency, in showing up for myself even when no one else noticed, in choosing rest without guilt, in allowing myself to enjoy moments without explaining or justifying them. I rebuilt my sense of identity, not around roles or expectations but around values, honesty, stability, emotional safety. I asked myself what kind of life I wanted to live, not what kind of life would be approved of. That question changed everything. My focus shifted naturally. Energy that once went into monitoring reactions and managing tension was redirected toward growth. I invested time in things that felt meaningful, learning, creating, strengthening relationships that felt mutual and grounded. I began to trust myself again. Slowly, carefully, I tested my instincts in small ways and paid attention to the outcomes. Each time I honored a boundary or made a decision aligned with my needs, my confidence strengthened. Distance helped. Not physical distance alone, but emotional distance. It allowed me to see how much of my previous life had been shaped by fear of disapproval. Without that fear constantly present, I could finally breathe. There were moments of doubt. Moments when old habits resurfaced and questioned whether this independence was selfish or unnecessary. But those moments passed more quickly now. I no longer argued with myself the way I used to. Building a life without them meant redefining success. It was no longer about being accepted. It was about feeling stable, feeling whole, feeling aligned with my own values. I learned that independence is not isolation. It is choice. It is the ability to decide where your energy goes and who has access to it. It is the freedom to grow without shrinking yourself for anyone else's comfort. As my focus shifted, so did my future. What once felt uncertain now felt intentional. Not perfect, not complete, but real. For the first time, my life was moving forward without dragging the weight of someone else's rejection behind it. And that made all the difference. Distance changed everything. Not immediately and not dramatically, but steadily. With space came perspective, and with silence came control. I was no longer reacting in real time to emotions that were never acknowledged. I was no longer pulled into patterns that left me drained. Silence became intentional. It was not avoidance. It was clarity. I learned that I did not need to explain my absence or justify my boundaries. Quiet gave me room to think without interruption, to feel without being corrected, to exist without performing. Emotional control followed naturally. When I stopped engaging, my reactions softened. Triggers lost their urgency. Words that once would have unsettled me now passed without impact. Distance reduced their power not because I became numb, but because I became grounded. Peace felt unfamiliar at first. I was so used to tension that calm felt suspicious. I waited for disruption, for guilt, for the urge to reach out and repair something that was no longer mine to fix. But over time, that expectation faded. Strength grew in that quiet. Not loud strength. Not defiant strength. The kind that does not need to prove anything. The kind that holds steady even when no one is watching. I noticed how my body responded. My breathing slowed. My thoughts felt clearer. The constant background anxiety eased. Silence allowed my nervous system to settle in ways conversation never did. Distance also brought honesty. Without constant interaction, I could see patterns more clearly. I could acknowledge what was unhealthy without minimizing it. I could accept reality without trying to change it. I stopped waiting for closure. Silence gave me my own. I realized that understanding does not always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from acceptance, from recognizing that not every story ends with resolution. Choosing quiet was an act of respect. For myself. For my healing. For the life I was building beyond old expectations. I learned that not every relationship deserves continued access, and not every silence needs to be filled. There was empowerment in restraint, in knowing when not to respond, in trusting my decision without seeking reassurance, in letting absence speak louder than words ever could. Finding power in distance and silence did not mean erasing the past. It meant no longer allowing it to control the present. And in that quiet, I found something I had been missing for a long time. Stability. Not borrowed. Not conditional. My own. Healing did not feel like relief at first. It felt unfamiliar, slow, and sometimes uncomfortable. Without constant tension to respond to, I had to learn who I was when nothing was demanding a reaction from me. That process required patience I did not know I had. Confidence returned quietly. Not as certainty but as trust. Trust in my instincts. Trust in my boundaries. Trust that I did not need to explain my choices for them to be valid. I began to move through situations with less hesitation, less internal debate. Emotional maturity grew from awareness. I learned to sit with feelings instead of rushing to fix or suppress them. I allowed myself to feel disappointment without turning it into self-criticism. I acknowledged sadness without attaching blame. Emotions became information, not threats. I stopped seeking validation externally. Not because I no longer cared, but because I understood its limits. Approval felt temporary. Self-respect felt stable. That distinction changed how I approached relationships, decisions, and conflict. I became more intentional. I chose where to invest energy and where to step back. I recognized early signs of imbalance and addressed them calmly. I no longer waited for situations to become unbearable before responding. Strength showed up in subtle ways. In saying no without guilt. In walking away without resentment. In maintaining boundaries even when they were misunderstood. I realized that strength does not require hardness. It requires clarity. Healing also meant redefining connection. I valued relationships that felt mutual, respectful, and consistent. I no longer chased closeness at the expense of my well-being. Emotional safety became non-negotiable. There were moments of doubt. Healing is not linear. Old thoughts resurfaced occasionally, testing the progress I had made. But those moments pass more quickly now. I met them with understanding instead of judgment. Confidence became embodied. I felt it in how I spoke, how I listened, how I responded. I was no longer performing strength. I was living it. Becoming stronger did not mean forgetting the past. It meant learning from it without being shaped by it. It meant carrying experience as wisdom, not weight. Healing gave me perspective. Strength gave me choice. Together, they allowed me to move forward with intention, grounded in who I was becoming rather than who I had been forced to be. That transformation did not announce itself. But it was real. And it was lasting. For a long time, I believed something was wrong with me. I believed that love had to be earned, that acceptance came with conditions, and that if I tried harder, stayed quieter, or became more agreeable, things would eventually change. That belief shaped how I moved through the world, how I treated myself, and how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice. I was wrong. The truth is simple but difficult to accept. My worth was never the problem. Some people are unable to give what they never learned how to hold. Their limitations are not a reflection of your value. Rejection does not always mean failure. Sometimes it means incompatibility. Sometimes it means emotional incapacity. Understanding this changed everything. I stopped measuring myself through someone else's behavior. I stopped using neglect as evidence of my inadequacy. I stopped shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold me. Self-worth is not granted. It is claimed. It comes from knowing who you are, what you deserve, and what you are no longer willing to accept. It comes from recognizing that love offered conditionally is not love worth chasing. Choosing myself was not selfish. It was necessary. Setting boundaries was not cruelty. Walking away was not weakness. Silence was not failure. It was self-respect. The real lesson was not about resentment or revenge. It was about clarity. About understanding that healing begins the moment you stop trying to prove your value to people who refuse to see it. If you have ever felt unwanted, overlooked, or made to question your place in someone's life, this is what I want you to remember. Your existence is not a mistake. Your needs are not flaws. Your worth does not decrease because someone failed to love you properly. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop asking for permission to matter. So here is the question I will leave you with. What would change in your life if you truly believed, without hesitation, that your worth was never the problem?